In our last study, we went over Herod the Great, the king over Israel at the time of Christ's birth. In this study, we're going to be going over Herod's successors, namely his 3 sons, his grandson, and then his great-grandson. Now, all of these that we're going over today are circled on this chart, but since we have already went over Herod the Great, let's go over the first 3 after him first. Archelaus, who is only mentioned once in the Bible. Then we see Philip the Tetrarch, who is only mentioned once in the Gospels, not the Philip in which Herod Antipas had taken the wife from. That was another unknown Philip as far as the Gospels are concerned. But then we have Herod Antipas, in whom is the Tetrarch that every Gospel reference to Herod, except for Luke 1 and 2 and Matthew 2, every other reference to Herod that we see in the Gospels is referring to this Herod Antipas. Now here's how all of these came to be in power. Herod the Great ruled Judea until 4 BC. At his death, his kingdom was divided among his 3 sons. And as you can tell by this map how they were all separated, Herod Archelaus ruled over the main part of the kingdom, Judea proper, Idumea, and Samaria. He ruled for 10 years until 6 AD, when he was banished, and I quote the histories, banished to Vienna in Gaul, where he lived for the remainder of his days. Herod Philip ruled over the northeast part of his father's kingdom, reigning until his death in 34 AD. Herod Antipas ruled over Galilee and Perea, ruling until he was exiled to Spain by Emperor Caligula in 39 AD, according to Josephus. We're going to get more into why he was exiled. That's actually a pretty important part of his history. Antipas was the Herod referenced in the New Testament who stole his brother Philip's wife, not Philip the Tetrarch that was just mentioned. When John the Baptist rebuked Antipas and his wife/niece, Herodias, for their sin, Antipas put John in prison. Sometime later, Herodias, through her daughter Salome, remember she did the dance for Herod Antipas and he was drunk and he offered her half his kingdom and all of this. Herodias, through her daughter, would request of Antipas that John the Baptist be beheaded. Herodias was so evil that she's often compared to being the New Testament Jezebel, as John the Baptist was compared to the Elijah of the Old Testament, and Jezebel persecuted Elijah. So did Herodias persecute John the Baptist, even having him beheaded. John the Baptist was then beheaded at the order of Antipas. Jesus himself would later be sent by Pontius Pilate to stand before Antipas, the ruler of Galilee. Luke 23:3 clearly tells us, and Pilate asked Jesus, saying, Art thou the king of the Jews? And Jesus answered him and said, Thou sayest it. Then said Pilate to the chief priest and to the people, I find no fault in this man. And they were the more fierce, saying, He stirreth up the people, referring to Jesus. He stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod Antipas' jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at that time. And when Antipas saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. Then he questioned with him in many words, but Jesus answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod Antipas with his men of war set him at naught, and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him again to Pilate. That's where Jesus actually got the robe that they placed upon him. It was Antipas doing it in a mocking fashion. And the same day, Pilate and Herod Antipas were made friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. So right there we can read about how wicked that this man truly was and how stupid and spiteful. He's much like the Ahab of Jezebel's day. Jezebel's husband, Ahab, a weak man, stupid, probably very unpleasant to be around. Later on, though, around 39 AD, almost a decade later, would Herodias' brother Agrippa accuse his uncle Antipas of conspiring against Emperor Caligula. Now, we're about to come to the life and reign of that same Agrippa, but just know Herodias' brother is the reason why Antipas and Herodias got in so much trouble with the Emperor Caligula, and whom was exceedingly evil Caligula. But the emperor believed the conspiracy told to him by Agrippa and exiled Antipas, along with his evil wife Herodias, to Lugdunum, where they later died. Which brings us to this very same Agrippa, known as Herod Agrippa I, in whom every Acts reference to Herod, except chapter 4, verse 27, and 13, verse 1, every other reference to Herod in the book of Acts refers to this Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa was the grandson of Herod the Great, who Emperor Caligula made ruler over his uncle Philip's territories in 37 AD. In 40 AD, he was given the territories of Herod Antipas, his uncle, which would be after he went to the Roman Emperor Caligula and said, "My uncle is conspiring against you," so this was probably a power move. In 41 AD, the new emperor Claudius, after Caligula, the new emperor Claudius added to Agrippa's territory the parts of Judea province that previously belonged to Herod Archelaus. Thus, Agrippa I practically reunited his grandfather Herod the Great's kingdom under his own rule. Agrippa I died only 3 years later in 44 AD. Herod Agrippa I was most known for his persecution of the early Christian church. Acts 12:1 makes reference to this very same Herod Agrippa I. Now about that time, Herod Agrippa I, the king, stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. One of the sons of Zebedee, he was the very first disciple killed at the behest of Herod Agrippa I. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread, so he also planned on killing Simon Peter. But remember, the angel comes, lets Peter out of prison at that time. And when Herod Agrippa I had sought for him, Simon Peter, and found him not, he examined the keepers of the jail cell, and commanded that they should be put to death. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea, and there abode. And upon a set day, Herod Agrippa I, arrayed in royal apparel, sat upon his throne and made an oration unto them. He gave this public speech, but this is speaking of the death of him. Now just listen to how gruesome this is. And the people gave a shout, saying, "It is the voice of a God and not of a man." Apparently he was a very good speaker. And immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory, and he was eaten of worms and gave up the ghost. Now this was some sort of parasitic infection, unto which there are all types, as seen by this graph right here. Ancient historian Flavius Josephus wrote that Agrippa I was incapacitated that day due to the pain induced by the parasitic infection. Agrippa reportedly died after suffering for 5 days, so this was a lingering, very painful death. And this brings us to the son of Agrippa I, known as Herod Agrippa II, and this is every Acts reference to Agrippa. He's not called Herod, but he is just called Agrippa in chapters 25 and 26. Anyone in whom remembers the trial of Paul, you'll remember this Agrippa. Herod Agrippa I had a son known as Agrippa II, who eventually took control of the land previously ruled by Philip. Agrippa II was also given the responsibility of supervising Herod's temple in Jerusalem. He was also involved in an incestuous affair with his sister Bernice. She had been married to her uncle Herod Pollio of Chalcis, not mentioned in Scripture. But after his death, moved in with her brother Agrippa II. The Apostle Paul would stand trial before this Agrippa II at Caesarea, and rather infamously responded to Paul's preaching with, "Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian." It's this one that said that. Late in his career, Herod Agrippa II saw that tensions were rising between Rome and the Jews. This would be right before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. But the tensions were beginning to rise around that time, and Agrippa II, he attempted unsuccessfully to prevent the war. Ultimately, he sided with Rome and was expelled by his Jewish subjects. He lived out the rest of his life in Rome. He was the last of Herod's line to be a king and the end of this, what is known as the Herodian dynasty. So let's give just a brief, quick recap over what we just went over. Herod Antipas, he is the most known among the gospel accounts of the other Herod. He's the one that took his brother's wife, Herodias. He's also the one that killed John the Baptist. He's also the one that mocked Jesus during trial. Herod Agrippa I, the one most called Herod in the book of Acts, he ruled over the entire kingdom of his grandfather Herod the Great. He also persecuted the church. He was known for that. He killed James, he jailed Simon Peter, and he died by a parasitic infection. And then there's Herod Agrippa II, in whom ruled over his great-uncle Philip's territory. He had an incestuous affair with his sister. He was a judge at Paul's trial in Caesarea. He sided with Rome during the Jewish revolt, and he was the last of the Herodian dynasty.